Thank you, and thank you for putting me straight after the coffee break while you're all nice and awake again. So, Christoph has already introduced my title. I'm from the Department of Ecology, Environment and Plant Sciences across the courtyard here. But I haven't done this work alone, of course, and you can see various other people from different departments at a lot at Stockholm University, and then also from SLU. And what I'm going to talk about today is based mainly on two new papers that came out earlier this year on our new work. So if you're interested in them, the references are here. So bottom trawling, for those of you that are not familiar with it, it's a method used for catching species that live on the seabed. And in the Baltic context, this means cod and European flounder. And the fisheries are located mainly in the southern Baltic Sea, as you see on this map here in the blue areas. I say pre-2019, there's been a ban on bottom trawling since July 2019 because of problems with stocks, cod stocks. But that's another question. We can come back to that later. But prior to 2019, there was heavy trawling in this area. And HELCOM already identified bottom trawling as a potential source of seabed disturbance in their report from 2018, the state of the Baltic Sea. In the graph, you see the different basins of the Baltic, and the red color indicates areas that they potentially think between 80 and 100% of the seabed could potentially be disturbed. And they hypothesize that this could be due to bottom trawling, shipping, and recreational boating. In some of the areas that you see in these basins, they're obviously too deep to really be affected by recreational boating or shipping, and we can assume that bottom trawling is probably the main cause of physical disturbance. But nobody had really looked at it, so that's what we have been trying to do. So taking a step back quickly, you need to know what a trawl looks like and how it interacts with the seabed. Otter trawls are the most common type in the Baltic Sea, and they basically consist of two trawl doors, which you see on the diagram. They can be quite large, as in the photograph here. You can just about see my colleague Claudia standing underneath this trawl door. So it's huge, it's several meters in diameter, made of solid steel. And these keep the gear on the seabed, and they also keep the net open in a horizontal plane. And then behind the trawl doors, you have the net being dragged behind, catching the fish. The ground gear is across the front of the net, and it's not particularly heavy, but it usually has some kind of rollers or something that helps the gear to move over the seabed smoothly and not get stuck on rocks and things like that. So it also has contact with the seabed. And although it's not as heavy as the trawl doors, it also is responsible for disturbance. And this whole gear can be several hundred meters long. So just to show you what it might look like, this is a single trawl track that we made ourselves using a very small trawler in the picture you see at the top right, much smaller than the previous picture. And we did an experimental trawling exercise outside Asker a few years ago. And here you see, in an acoustic image of the seabed, the parallel tracks made by the trawl doors, and they throw up piles of sediment, a furrow where the door has scraped through the sediment, and a pile of sediment thrown up at the side, which can be several meters wide. And then in the middle, you can't see it in the multi-beam image, but you see very shallow tracks, just a few centimeters deep, caused by these rollers on the ground gear. In an area where it's commercially trawled, now there's rather too much light in this room, but I think you can see the crisscrossing pattern on this multi-beam image. This is an area from near Bornholm, northwest of Bornholm, taken in 2019. And actually this area has hardly been trawled 3 years previously to this, but you can still see many tracks on the seabed that have been caused by commercial trawling in that area. So we know that this happens, but we don't really, and many other people have shown these kinds of images, it's nothing new, but we don't really know what it means for sort of larger scale processes. So one of the aspects we wanted to study was sediment suspension. Here I've showed you what's actually on the seabed, but a lot of sediment is suspended too. And it's not just the physical contact of the gear with the seabed, but you also get hydrodynamic forces around these trawl doors which suspend sediment off the seabed. So actually, even without any bottom contact, you can get suspension. And frequent disturbance of a seabed can also make it less cohesive, so that the next time a trawler comes through, it can be even easier for sediment to be suspended. The doors obviously penetrate a lot deeper because they're a lot heavier, and they also have this enormous hydrodynamic forces around them. But they only affect quite a small area of the seabed, whereas the ground gear, which stretches across the front of the net, affects a much larger area. So one thing we were interested in was trying to get a relative idea of which is more important for suspension. So we've taken a practical field approach to our studies, and we've been studying what is suspended, how much is suspended, what does it consist of, where does it go, and what does this mean. So just to show you a little film here, always dangerous with films on Zoom, but I think you can see. So this is looking backwards along the top of a trawl net. So it's about 2 meters above the seabed. Oops. Sorry. And you can see that the sediment's being suspended off the seabed and coming up many meters above the seabed. And we have a turbidity meter at the point where this arrow is, which you can't currently see in this image. And we measured up to 500 milliliters of sediment per liter in this sediment cloud. It's pretty high concentrations. This was using quite a large trawler in Hanöbukten, if you're interested. We also did this more small scale at Aska. I showed you already the multi-beam image of the parallel tracks. This is now looking at a sort of slice through the water column from roughly the sediment surface at the top to the seafloor at the bottom. And we're looking at a track where the boat has moved from right to left. And what you see is natural turbidity looks a little bit like this at the seafloor. A small amount of turbidity is there naturally. But you can see directly behind the trawl, you're getting this sediment plume being released up into the water column. And after about 2 hours, that was the first time we were actually able to take measurements directly after the trawl. And by that stage, we were getting concentrations of around 7 milligrams per liter, which is not extremely high, but it's roughly twice natural turbidity in that area, compared to in that video I just showed you up to 500, which is more typical, probably directly behind the trawl. And that can be many hundred times background. And we were also interested in what is this sediment, this particulate matter. So we measured also content of various elements in the sediment cloud, and it contained obviously a lot of particulate carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and also things like iron and manganese. Basically anything that's in the sediment is being suspended. So a lot of organic matter is being released into the water column. Yeah. Just to give you an idea of scale here, it's hard to get your head around the kind of how the spatial scale of this. This is a diagram of turbidity from the trawl track at 0 to 500 meters away. So that's roughly from this room to Studenthuset across the other side of the university. And in the vertical scale, it's around 10 meters, this diagram. So that's the kind of volume of water that the sediment is occupying. And 10 meters is roughly this high. So imagine from here to Studenthuset and several floors of a building high. In this sediment cloud, then, I told you already there's particulate elements present, but we also measured dissolved nutrients. We were interested in that too. And we do see, this is the same sort of scale, 0 to 500 meters. And we did see elevated concentrations of dissolved nutrients as well in the sediment cloud, but only up to just a few hours after the trawling event. Then we couldn't measure them anymore. So a very fast release of dissolved matter. But the sediment cloud remained in suspension for some time. So even 3 days after trawling, we see again. So now the scales are both bigger. We're up to around a kilometre away. We're still seeing sediment. It's been transported with currents. And the sediment cloud has kind of sunk down, settled out. So it's really just a few meters, up to maybe 5 meters above the seabed by this stage. But still, 3 days after trawling, we're still seeing this thing in the water column. And we estimate that around 9.5 tons of sediment were suspended per kilometre of track. So it's quite a lot. And also, yeah, of course, a similar pattern for particulate nutrients. So what does this mean for the actual sediment, going back to the seafloor? Well, the trawl, by removing surface sediment and suspending it into the water, the trawl's basically removing and reducing organic carbon content of the surface sediment. So in these diagrams, the black lines are now profiles down into the sediment. The black ones are not trawled, and the open dashed lines are trawled. So you can see in this diagram the organic carbon has basically been removed from the surface sediment, and it's been suspended into the water column. And we can see similar things for, in this case, for example, this is porosity, so it's telling us something about the porewater volume. By removing this fluffy surface layer, we're exposing sort of more solid, deeper sediment, and the porewater is now mixed into the overlying water. And this we also showed by measuring fluxes of nutrients from sediments into the water column over a number of days after trawling. We saw releases of all of the main nitrogen compounds, phosphate, and also dissolved inorganic carbon. All of these were outfluxing from the sediment after trawling. Again, the dissolved substances are short pulse, but the sediment itself, these kinds of sediment gradients were maintained for up to several weeks. So although the water column was affected for just a few hours, the sediment itself was showing disturbed biogeochemistry for many days or even weeks afterwards. So what does it matter? What does all this mean for, on a wider scale, that we're getting this suspension? If we think about the turbidity itself, turbidity is not that great for a lot of organisms. It clogs fish's gills. Filter-feeding organisms also find it difficult to cope with a lot of organic or a lot of suspended matter. If you suspend a lot of sediment regularly from the seabed and it gets carried away with currents, you can actually end up with much coarser sediment after a while. And this changes the whole habitat structure for organisms, including, in fact, the target species of fish that you're interested in, presumably. And this has been shown actually in other studies too. I said at the beginning that trawling in the Baltic before it got stopped temporarily was mostly at depths where other types of physical disturbance are pretty minimal. They're below the sort of storm resuspension depths, up 50, 60 meters deep, for example. So that's really the only source of physical disturbance in many of those areas. And in those areas there are also areas where you often get temporal or permanent hypoxia and anoxia. In addition to that, then, suspending organic matter into the water column also usually means an increase in respiration and a reduction of oxygen in the water column. So there's potential for combined stresses there. And I showed you how far the sediment cloud can travel after a few days. There's implications here that trawling is not just impacting the actual place where trawling is occurring, but even several kilometers away, these sediment clouds are being transported. And if there are, for example, marine protected areas nearby, they could be potentially being affected by this suspension. So just briefly to think a little bit about nutrient and carbon cycles too. There's been a lot of talk recently about carbon sequestration and storage in bottom sediments. And this is just a new field of research really in the trawling context. So I don't have any final answers yet, but it's very topical. But what we do know from our studies and other studies is that if you have an area where trawling is very frequent, you can pretty much be sure that chemical gradients and chemical processes in the sediment will never have a time to stabilize. They'll always be in a sort of state of flux because you're always disturbing them. They don't have time to get back into this kind of 3D chemical structure that are needed to drive seafloor processes. And as I said just now, suspension itself can increase organic matter breakdown in the water and then consuming oxygen in the water column, which can potentially worsen hypoxia. Then the big question is sediment carbon storage capacity reduced? And there are a few papers that have come out this year which claim that trawling could potentially be a source of greenhouse gases. I think some of them are a bit extreme, but I think it's definitely something we need to consider. And basically, I'm sorry to end on this note, but we don't really know, basically, at the moment, how trawling might affect carbon and nutrient cycling in the Baltic. I think it's not really been thought about before as a kind of a process that affects wider scale nutrient and carbon cycling. So we've just started scratching at the surface, and hopefully I can come back in a year or so and tell you even more. So I think I'll finish there. Thanks.
Thank you, Claire.